That's one of those things I think that could perhaps be challenged within this, is have the DNO set a reasonable level of curtailment and a reasonable end stop.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Roadnight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk. Today, I'm joined by Pete Aston, one of Roadnight Taylor's Connectologists, and we are discussing the significant code review and specifically the tactics and strategies that are going to be used by sort of various parties within connections in order to game this new system. As I've said many times before, there will be many winners and many losers across different schemes, and winning and losing can be go sort of millions of pounds one way or the other. So Pete, I'm just going to start off by asking you, and only you, because sadly we lost Catherine, who was on this due to issues with her internet, but so I'm going to ask only you, what's the biggest risk that you see when you think of gaming and SCR?
So I think for me, Hugh, the biggest risk is around the point of connection voltage that you're going to be offered as a connection. So there is going to be a real advantage to DNOs in offering you a higher point of connection voltage so that they don't have to trigger reinforcement, because under the SCR rules, essentially customers pay a lot less towards reinforcement than they do at the moment. Demand connections will pay nothing towards reinforcement. Generation connections will only pay for reinforcement at the voltage level they're connecting at, and not higher voltage levels. So from a DNO point of view, who's only got a limited pot of money, they would be quite keen not to trigger reinforcement for customer connections, and so they would have an advantage in offering a higher point of connection voltage. However, there are rules that the DNOs will need to stick to around minimum scheme and so on. But it's just a consideration that needs to be made. So flipping it around from the point of view of developers, there will be some consideration around sizing that connection. So if I push the sort of capacity of this connection too high, that might mean that DNO has no choice but to offer me a higher voltage for the point of connection. But if I take the capacity lower, maybe the DNO will be sort of happy to offer me that sort of lower voltage point of connection. So I think that there's going to be a little bit of gaming around that, and whether that will result in sort of smaller connections coming through, because there's been a tendency recently to over the last couple of years to see much larger connections coming through at distribution and then at transmission level. So I wonder whether at distribution this will lead to smaller schemes that are hopefully going to connect at lower voltages and avoid reinforcement costs. So it'd be interesting to see whether that's something that actually happens as a result of this.
Yeah, and I guess it already happens that people put in applications at the wrong scale and end up with a higher voltage POC than they would have hoped for. And also with the engineers within the DNOs who, obviously are incredibly pushed for time, sometimes simply getting it wrong and providing a connection voltage that could be bettered. But clearly this actually gives an incentive, and not to say that there be anyone being particularly devious, but it does actually perversely sort of incentivize that.
There is another consequence that you might want to flip that around, in as much as so as a developer you could potentially get that lower point of connection voltage, and so the DNO then potentially you might have to trigger reinforcement at a higher voltage level. That could potentially work against you if the reinforcement was going to take a long time to do. If the reinforcement was going to take 5 or 6 years to complete, and you would much prefer a connection sooner than that, all other things being equal, then you might actually be happier with a higher point of connection voltage. So might be a bit more of an expensive connection, but actually might be able to get connected quicker, which might have advantages. So I think that depends on the sort of reinforcement that might be triggered. So there might be a trade-off between a lower connection charge for a lower point of connection voltage, but a faster connection if you connect at a higher voltage. So it's just one of those things. It's going to be a bit of a site-specific question around that, but it's definitely worth thinking about.
And I guess that brings us on to the interim arrangements, because you could have a tidal wave of connection applications on the 1st of April. That's going to lead ultimately to a tidal wave of reinforcement works. And if we see happening at distribution what we've seen at transmission, that could delay connection timeframes, or at least kind of reinforcement timeframes, just by sheer dint of the volume of reinforcement works that need to be carried out. So do you want to just explain the interim arrangements around flexible connections?
Yeah, so we talked through this on quite a few of the webinars. So the interim arrangements are going to be that DNOs are going to have to offer flexible arrangements. So by a flexible connection arrangement, we're talking about something like active network management, where your power output's ramped up and down to sort of match the capacity available on the network, or it could be a timed connection, or it could be a variety of other
or indeed
offerings
demand, because they'll be offering flexibility for demand connections as well.
Yes. Sorry, this would be for demand as well as generation. Not every type of demand would be suitable. You wouldn't really be able to do flexible arrangement for a housing estate probably, but big chunky single sort of premises demand connections could probably enter into some sort of flexible arrangement. So the idea is that I think there's probably two types of flexible arrangement in the sense of one could be an enduring solution. So if there is some reinforcement under the new rules that you would have to pay for, and you want to permanently not have to pay for that reinforcement, then you could have an enduring flexible arrangement, so an A&M connection, for example, for the entirety of the lifetime of your project. Or there might be situations where you're not going to pay towards a reinforcement scheme, but the DNO can't deliver that reinforcement scheme very quickly, and so you're going to be able to be offered an interim connection, interim flexible solution to allow you to connect prior to that reinforcement happening. And within that, the DNO is going to have to give you a cap on the upper level of curtailment that you could experience, and an end point where that interim curtailment will finish.
Just to be clear, that curtailment, that is uncompensated. I think that's the key here, isn't it?
Yes, correct. So that curtailment is exactly the same as curtailment is now under A&M. That interim curtailment is not compensated unless you go over the cap that the DNO gives you in terms of that upper level of curtailment. So if the DNO says, right, your interim curtailment is definitely going to be no more than 20% curtailment, and you have 30% curtailment in a year, they would compensate you for that. And equally, at the end of the, let's say, 5-year period that they've assigned for this interim curtailment, if you still have to be curtailed after that 5 years, they would also pay you, or they would contract some flexibility services somewhere else on the network to let you get your full output. So that's quite good. However,
onto the kind of the gaming point, and that's who sets the cap and who determines when the reinforcement will be completed as well.
So the reinforcement completion timescales all in the DNO's hands. The end point for when that interim curtailment is going to finish is also with the DNO. So we haven't quite yet seen the mechanism by which the DNOs are going to set the absolute level of curtailment and the endpoint for the curtailment. But
and is that an ENA process that they're going through, or is Ofgem involved?
Yeah, they are going. They're going through that process. So I'm pretty sure it should be concluding fairly soon. That the DNOs through the ENA trying to get some sort of consistent way of both setting the A&M level and setting the end point where the curtailment finishes. So there should be a relatively consistent way of doing it. It doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same. So it's not always going to be 20% in 5 years, but it will be site specific, project specific, but there will be a methodology for doing it. So in terms of the level of curtailment, it could be very, very high. I think that's one thing just to note, is that you're not necessarily going to get an interim level of curtailment that you're happy with and that you can accommodate. So we're already seeing levels of curtailment in many parts of the country where it's just ridiculously high. Like I think we were talking about one yesterday where Philip Bale said he'd seen one where it was like 95%.
Yeah, 99, I think he said.
99 was it? So clearly 20% is bad. 99% is just ridiculous. So you're not necessarily going to get a level of curtailment that you're happy with. So in those circumstances, whilst you have been offered an interim curtailment solution, it might not be something you can accept. So you might still need to just sit there and wait for the reinforcement to happen. And will DNOs give a ridiculously long end stop for this interim curtailment? So if they go, well, we think we can deliver this within 5 years, so we're going to say 10, just to give ourselves a buffer. I don't know if that's going to happen. Not quite sure exactly how they're going to set that, but that is a risk. And that's one of those things, I think, Hugh, that could perhaps be challenged within this is, have the DNO set a reasonable level of curtailment and a reasonable end stop.
Great. There is cost associated with implementing A&M schemes. Now, I know that certainly WPD socialises that cost to an extent, or at least it's cost apportioned, but even so, there is a cost associated with it. And how's that going to work if you are offered an interim flexible arrangement?
Yes, it's an interesting one. I think we think the sort of decision point on this is probably around timescale of reinforcement works. So in some DNOs, you could potentially get a bill for a few $100,000 to implement an A&M scheme. So it can be quite significant. It sort of depends on how the DNOs are implementing A&M and which providers they're using.
And would that be assuming that it is or isn't cost apportioned? Are there some DNOs who aren't cost apportioning, and therefore actually you could have a really significant cost?
I'd be surprised if it was any more than a few $100,000 to implement the A&M scheme. So it's sort of slightly difficult to know exactly what they're doing and therefore what cost apportionment should or shouldn't be applied to those A&M systems. But yeah, I'd be surprised if it was any more than a few $100,000. However, I think the point that we were talking about yesterday was if your reinforcement's only going to take a year or 2 years to implement, is it and after which time you wouldn't need to be on A&M, is there any point paying that few $100,000 towards getting an interim A&M solution when actually you could have just waited a year or 18 months or something and then just connect completely uncurtailed? So again, that comes back to what is that reinforcement solutions being offered specifically for your site and timescales to get that implemented. So I mean, there will be some reinforcement schemes that are just going to take a really long time period to deliver, in which case you really do want to talk about an interim solution.
Yeah, that's, I mean, obviously most of what we deal with is, sort of minimum of typically tens, if not hundreds of megawatts. And just thinking about that, the potential for taking on that cost of the A&M scheme, if you are a smaller behind the meter project, if you've got a demand site like a factory or whatever it might be, it's very expensive and complex to implement A&M behind the meter in any event. And if you're actually having to pay for the implementation of the whole scheme, that is going to be a serious issue for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've only got a few megawatts of export from a factory or something, that is quite a lot of costs. That few $100,000 towards the A&M scheme is going to be a massive percentage of the cost of your connection works. Whereas if you're building a 150 megawatt battery or something connected at 132 kV, a few $100,000,
yeah,
you might not even think twice about it. So it's very much site specific depending on the scale of your connection. And sometimes with these A&M systems, it's just the cost is what the cost is per site. It's not size capacity related. It might just be to connect you to the A&M system, we need this kit, and it's going to cost this much. And it doesn't matter whether you're 1 megawatt or 100 megawatts, it's going to be the same price.
And for demand, if we look at the different kind of types of demand, for EV charging operators, they can typically tolerate a certain amount of flexibility. So the fact that DNOs are going to be forced to offer that flexible arrangement is a good thing. Obviously, they might have to bear that cost, which if you're putting in a small number of chargers might be an issue. So that could be a blocker. But actually, just thinking about if you are in that sort of top 5th percentile, where you are likely to go over that high cost cap. First of all, I mean, flexibility is not going to work for you. If you're a data center, flexibility just isn't an option in any event.
In terms of just thinking around the cost of the flexible connection, the A&M, for want of a better word, active network management, then there will be certain types of demand where, like you say, you just can't be flexible, and that in fact you're the opposite of flexible. You might be entirely inflexible, and you might want a really high level of security, both in terms of the number of circuits into your site and in terms of the access to the network. So, like you say, data centers are a prime example of wanting very high levels of security. So I can't imagine any data center going anywhere near a flexible connection.
Sure.
Because they're going to want 2 circuits into the site. They're going to want the full import capacity available 24/7. So they're not going to want to ramp up and down. But like you say, EV chargers, well, okay, if they've got a slightly lower capacity. They just either charge the cars a bit slower or they have less chargers available. That's just not a problem for them. I mean, it might annoy some punters who want some power, but yeah, I think in the long run, it's not such an issue for EV charging. Sure. Or take hydrogen electrolysis. That is also quite flexible sort of demand, a large-scale demand being talked about quite a lot. You know, if you have to reduce your demand, well, you just reduce the amount of hydrogen you're producing. So it's quite flexible in that sense to interruptions in supply and availability of capacity.
Sure. I guess it's just doing the math, getting comfortable on the level of curtailment.
Yeah,
sure. That feels to me like a really good point for us to take a very quick break. If you're liking this podcast so far, you may want to pop over to the Connectology page on Roadnight Taylor's website and sign up to the Connectology newsletter for much more know-how, insight and thought leadership in electricity network connections. The link to this is in the description. Don't miss out on any of the articles, explainers, videos, webinars and podcasts that Roadnight Taylor's Connectologists share to give you an edge and help you overcome your grid frustrations. Welcome back, and Pete, let's just pick up with post-acceptance. Is that going to get easier or harder, the work that needs to be done now?
So I think that there's only going to be so much you can do at the application stage. So applications are going to have to be a bit more intelligent in the sense of, I think you're going to really need to know upfront what you want to apply for, because there are lots of variations and nuances around this. So, you're going to have to be prepared to argue your case when you're putting in an application with the DNO. But there's also going to be certain things that you just know a DNO just can't achieve within a 90-day offer issue period. And some of those things are going to have to be discussed post-acceptance. So I think getting that balance right between what you apply for and what you then might want to put in the post-acceptance discussion phase is going to be important. So one of the things that you might want to go into the post-acceptance discussion phase is around that split between reinforcement and flexible connection. So just as an example, let's say you're a generator connecting at 33 kV. You might trigger reinforcement at 33 kV and you're going to have to pay for it, because that's under the new rules. You do pay for reinforcement at your connection voltage. And you might trigger reinforcement at 132 kV that you're not going to pay for. But either way, you'd have to wait for both of those sets of reinforcement to be complete before you can connect. So, what is the offer issued on the basis of? Is the offer issued to you on the basis of, an interim arrangement? So you get A&M, for example, for both in relation to the 33 and 132 as an interim arrangement. And then you get taken off A&M once the reinforcement's done? Or do you accept an offer on the basis of just reinforcement being done, you waiting for it and then connecting afterwards? Or could there be a halfway house? Could you say, well, I know that the 33 kV reinforcement isn't going to take very long. I'm just going to wait for that to be done. There's no point. Maybe you're curtailed massively because of that 33 reinforcement. Makes no sense to wait on an interim flexible arrangement. I'm just going to wait for them to reconduct to this 33 line, pay for it, and then I'll connect whilst they're still doing the 132 reinforcement, and I'll then go on a flexible arrangement for the 132 reinforcement. So there could be that sort of mix and match approach, and that could be quite protracted discussions with the DNO. And I really don't think that could happen within the offer issue period. So it's almost certainly got to be post acceptance.
Whichever way you look at it, the teams, and I think specifically about the system planners really, but the teams who are putting together the connection offers are going to be absolutely drowning. Even if they are allowed extensions, their workload is going to be horrific. And most of them are out there just trying to do the best job that they possibly can. As we know, sometimes because of the pressure they're under, they already have to be somewhat perfunctory, I guess. I mean, you worked within connections, so Pete was head of system planning at WPD across across all their license areas, and responsible for some 500 extra high voltage connection offers going out at generation and demand. So you must have seen the pressure that the system planners are under. How do you think this might play out when they have this tidal wave, and how might that impact on the likelihood that you do get the right offer at the right connection voltage with the right flexible arrangement?
Yeah, it's It's really tricky as a DNO. It was almost a daily conversation around work pressure, delivering offers, and so on. So it's a massive issue, and I suspect it's a massive issue in every DNO. That tension that they all have between resourcing levels and the amount of work they've got to do. Because let's not forget the DNO sort of technical teams are not just doing connections; they're also trying to deliver business plan reinforcement schemes as well. They're also trying to assist projects teams with asset replacement works. They're also trying to help with diversionary works and speccing, cable sizes for that. So there's a whole heap of things that they're trying to do that aren't just connections, as well as then trying to deliver all the connections work. So DNOs have a really difficult job and are doing, like you say, the best they can to do it. I think this SCR delivery from 1st of April is just going to be very challenging for them. I think it all depends on levels of applications. This bow wave, is there going to be one or isn't there going to be one? So, we amongst the developers we work with, we're still seeing a sort of continued level of activity and interest in making applications and so on. So not everything is slowing down now. So developers just storing up loads of stuff for 1st of April. I'm not convinced yet that they are. They might be, but I think we just got to wait and see. But even if there wasn't a bow wave in new applications, although I suspect there will be some, just the new rules alone are going to be challenging for the DNOs to manage because they're quite complicated, like we've been talking about quite a lot. So massive challenge for the DNOs. It wouldn't surprise me if the DNOs planners are just going to be pleased to have got an offer out to you, let alone got an offer out.
So if you're under massive pressure and there is an easy computer says no answer that you can bang out because you've got to do another 5 in that day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just going to need. I think it's going to need dialogue. Rather than trying to view it as a confrontational experience, view it as a collaboration. Knowing that the DNOs are under pressure. And therefore maybe haven't had a chance to look into it maybe as deeply as you have in some instances, or certain aspects of it. Work with them rather than against them, and in that way they come up with
and on
good
that score,
together.
it's kind of, certainly from our perspective, it is kind of more of the same, working with them more, doing the work for them more in order that they don't have to rely on their computer to spit out a no, actually giving them the answer in order that they can give you what they want. They're going to thank you for it, and working with them and feeling a certain amount of compassion for the position that they're going to be in. So I guess this is very much a work in progress. We know that SCR isn't perfect, and we aren't going to see any SCR offers coming out until probably June, and then we're going to see an awful lot of tweaking and bedding in, and everyone's going to have to work together on that. Yeah,
absolutely. So certainly at EHV level, where there is like 65 working day turnaround time, offers that applications that are made at the beginning of April won't come out sort of till end of June, beginning of July. I guess lower voltage level offers at LV and HV will come out earlier than that. But yeah, so I think it's really going to take till the end of this year for this to properly bed in, both from the DNO point of view and from the developer point of view. So DNO is trying to work out what they're going to do when developers ask for things that they haven't thought about yet, which is almost inevitably going to be the case, because no sooner in the DNO world have you developed a policy framework that nicely fits certain rules that you get some developer going, yeah, but we want to do this, and then you go, well, okay, I can see why you're asking to do that, and I've got no particular reason why we can't do that, but my rules doesn't say that you can. So you go through this process of then developing your rules on the back of these sort of what developers are asking for. So it's going to take at least till the end of this year, I think, for it to properly bed in. That's quite fun because we've got the opportunity then to help it bed in a good
Absolutely,
way.
Yeah, no, I think it's really positive, and hopefully the whole connection community will see this as an opportunity to work with the network operators. We've already got them reaching out to us to ask us for our opinion on different sort of approaches that they're looking at taking. And hopefully there'll be a lot more of that throughout that initial 65 working days. It might be extended, obviously, and then beyond. Lots of opportunity to engage. So great, Pete. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, it was just you and no Catherine, and I know that I was a very poor substitute. But thank you very much, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Very much hope this has been useful, and see you on the other side. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttailor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Roadnight Taylor Connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttailor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.